we do have Martin George online, attorney at law, and that's where we'll speak to this whole question. There's so many things to talk about, and of course, as soon as... Yes, good morning, Mr. Martin George.
Yes, hi, good morning to you, Brother B, and good morning, Mr. Cox. It feels like ages since I've been on this show, man. I miss you guys.
So long, man, and we miss you, and we're glad to have you.
When I was in Estonia, they were asking about this show in Latvia, in all those Eastern European countries, Slovenia, they love this show. They follow it every morning,
Very good.
Keep up the good
an
work.
award-winning show indeed, and clearly people view us all over the world. All right, Mr. George, let's get into this embarrassment and, of course, the vindication of Ola Christopher as Commissioner of Police. First of all, Roger Gaspard would have said that there is no evidence to pursue this matter, and so she was freed of all charges and allowed to return to work. Just an overview as to, and of course the embarrassment that I heard you on another program, no amount of money can suffice. But let's speak to the whole situation that led to why she has returned as Commissioner of Police.
Yes, Brother B, it's important when we are taking actions such as this, particularly with persons who occupy high-profile public positions, that we are always very circumspect and judicious in our approach. We have to ensure that we dot every I, cross every T, because really and truly the reputational harm and damage which can result from this type of public embarrassment is something that, you can never recover from that. Regardless of what, people will always remember you for the scandal and the bacchanal rather than for the fact that you were eventually vindicated. And that's our nature as Trinbagonians also, we love the humor, the rumor, the movilang, the old talk, rather than the hard, cold truth. Because the movilang and bacchanal is always more, interesting, it's spicy, it's salacious, and, we love to, make a joke about it and that kind of thing. But, when you're talking about someone's character, their career, their reputation, it's something we have to take seriously and always tread cautiously when you are approaching these sorts of issues. And, the DPP did say in his release on Saturday that even though he felt that there was not sufficient evidence to lay charges, he did venture his opinion that there may have been sufficient evidence for the arrest. However, the question is the manner and, the way this arrest was done, the way it was played out in the public space, being arrested in her office by her subordinates, hauled off, in the full glare of public scrutiny, it's something that I guess could have been managed differently, but, the way it ended up playing out, it really was, a scenario that inflicted maximum pain, suffering, and embarrassment upon the Commissioner of Police.
All right, I want to just go, Mr. Cox and I were speaking about the processes of electing a Commissioner of Police. Obviously, the Police Service Commission has its role, and all right. Yes. So we just had a little glitch there, but let me just continue. Yeah. So the PSC, the Police Service Commission, has its role, and there's a process that is a bit tedious, and you and all maybe give its critique as to why this unnecessary drawn-out process is required for electing or selecting a Commissioner of Police. Just walk us through what the process is and what happens after she leaves office.
Right. So the thing is, it's something that ought to be an ongoing process in terms of the interviewing of candidates, the vetting of candidates, the selection. In other words, you are supposed to be conducting this as an HR exercise, because if you are doing, your planning for the future, all right, and you're looking to see, well, okay, who you can train for promotion, right? Because I mean, it's basically succession planning you're doing. You want to ensure that you have sufficient cadre of deputy commissioners who are capable and able, to be, among the pool of candidates that you can choose from to create a merit list. And then remember that merit list is then submitted to the president, with, your number one choice at the top. And then, of course, that merit list is then passed on from the president to the parliament, and then the parliament votes on it. And basically, the governing body that has the majority in parliament, they are the ones who effectively end up choosing who they want as commissioner. All right. And, we have seen scenarios where even the number one choice was not necessarily the choice of the government of the day. And instead, they voted against the number one choice, they voted against the number two choice, they voted against the number three choice until they got number four, who was the person they wanted. That has happened in Trinidad and Tobago. So, it's quite interesting that after all the shenanigans and machinations to produce this merit list, it is still up to the government of the day as to who they really want from that merit list as commissioner.
Cox.
Miss, now, I just shifting back to the initial part of the conversation, just to just get some clarity here, right, Mr. George? So, Pamela Elder, representing the Commissioner of Police, is saying that the officers placed the cart before the horse and that they have intentions to sue the officers who made the arrest and the senior officers who advised them to make the arrest. However, we heard we saw the High Court judge ruling, which found that her suspension, Mrs. Airwood Christopher's suspension, was legal. I just want to juxtapose that ruling with what lawyer Elder is saying in terms of the placement of the cart before the horse. Just add some context for that first, please, Mr. George.
Okay, all right. So let me disaggregate the two. First of all, the judge's ruling in relation to, the lawfulness of the suspension, that relates to the actions of the Police Service Commission. So in other words, the actions of the Police Service Commission were vindicated by the judge when he indicated that, look, they had a duty to take action, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with them taking action as they did, to preserve, good administration of justice and good order within the service, So therefore, the Police Service Commission was actually vindicated by yesterday's ruling in terms of their decision to suspend. And I will just share with you, Brother B and Mr. Cox, because I know your viewers and listeners are always very much on the cutting edge of, all the intellectual debates and discussions. There is this case from the Privy Council, a 2019 case called Jamaicans for Justice versus the Jamaican Police Service Commission. And that in that case, the Privy Council indicated quite clearly that a body such as a Police Service Commission, which is a constitutionally appointed body, has a duty to investigate any serious allegations against any top officers under their remit and purview. So therefore, that case actually supports and backs our Police Service Commission, because remember, the Privy Council is still our highest court. So therefore, as a precedent and guide, that case is very instructive. And, I would urge members of the public who, they love to do the study and analysis to look at that case. It's a 2019 Privy Council decision, Jamaicans for Justice versus the Police Service Commission of Jamaica. Right. So that's what happened in the court ruling. Right. Now, back to the other part of the question, Mr. Cox, in terms of Ms. Elder's statement that she intends to sue the police officers who would have taken that action. That, it's a nice sound bite for the media and for the cameras. And, in the heat of the moment, yes, it sounds excellent. But it's a pathway that is, very challenging if one wishes to reach a successful conclusion, because at the end of the day, you already had the DPP, and I think in some ways, even the court may have made reference to, the arrest. Right, the DPP has pronounced, and he said that he thought that there might have been sufficient evidence to justify the arrest. So, with that as the backdrop, it's going to be a fairly steep hill to climb if it is that Miss Elder is seeking to actually launch that sort of legal challenge to the actions of the officers. Now, it doesn't mean that the manner in which it was done was correct or proper, or that it couldn't be handled more discreetly and professionally, without all the fanfare and drama. But as to the legality of the actions, unless you are able to show that there was some definite malice or some, Machiavellian plot behind the scenes, designed to, ensure that this happened in that particular way, and there were persons, pulling the levers and, pulling the strings behind the scenes just to achieve that result of the embarrassment publicly and the humiliation, you know, then without that evidence, it's going to be very challenging. Because if you have that clear evidence, then of course you can really think in terms of misbehavior, in terms of public office, for persons who may have been involved in that sort of behavior. But I would imagine it's going to be a challenge to actually get that evidence and to be able to present it in a court in a way that convinces a judge to say, well, look, you are going to be able to take actions against the police officers themselves who may have been involved in this investigation and the arrest.
But there have been, Mr. George, a lawsuit for wrongful arrest. Can that be categorized or fit within that same framework of wrongful arrest and lawsuit pursuit?
Well, if you have a scenario where there really is absolutely no evidence to have justified an arrest, or if the arrest takes place in circumstances where there's really no real power of arrest, then of course you would be successful in a wrongful arrest lawsuit. But as I say, we have to look at this against the backdrop of the DPP giving his view on it. Of course, his view is not binding on a court of law to say that a judge has to accept the fact that the DPP said so, but it certainly is of some sort of persuasive authority. And one would imagine that he would only have expressed that view after analyzing and assessing the evidence available to the officers at the time of the arrest.
Okay, and of course, she is reinstated. And in terms of Brother B's question earlier on with regards to the process to select commissioner of police, her chances, though, I know you don't have you can't see into the future, but based on all that transpired, the possibility of an extension of her contract, how possible is that?
Well, that's it's both a government decision and a PSC decision, if you understand me, because first of all, the contract extension, the 3-year contract, that's a decision for the government and the cabinet to decide whether they want to offer her that extension. If it is that that's their view and they notify the Police Service Commission, then the Police Service Commission's role would really be to appoint her in that regard. However, if it is that there is a question as to whether the extension is going to be granted, or a decision is taken that it's not going to be granted, then of course you then now start looking down the ranks in terms of the merit list, because one must assume that by now the Police Service Commission does have its merit list of persons who can be suitable to fill that post. And we must bear in mind that this is a merit list. It's not an age list or a list that is simply by the number of years you have sat in a chair in the police service, to say, well, you should be the next in line because of seniority. It's supposed to be based on an assessment of several aspects. Therefore, it's a merit list. So if they do have that merit list, then I would imagine that they would then forward that list to the president and it would go through the normal channel.
Given that Junior Benjamin would have served as acting commissioner in the absence of Earl Christopher, would that merit list, would that be given consideration in the merit list, or how will that work in any possibility for Junior Benjamin to hold the position of commissioner?
Well, the thing is going to be, it would be based on an assessment of whom they consider most suitable for a permanent appointment. There's a vast difference between the acting appointment and the permanent filling of the position. Right? So you have to consider all the factors and the criteria in terms of longevity, because again, you don't want to just put somebody there, for a kobo sweat. If it's somebody who, is due to retire in 3 months, or, although we have seen that sort of absurdity happen already in Trinidad and Tobago, But the reality is that if the Police Service Commission is doing proper long-term succession planning, then they ought to have identified candidates whom they could say, well, look, yes, if we appoint this person, they would have at least 3 years or 5 years to be able to really execute the mandate of the office of Commissioner of Police, rather than you just doing a stopgap measure to say, well, okay, look, we'll just put this person here, for the time being until we could do better, so to speak. It's those criteria I would think that they would look at. And once Mr. Benjamin fits the criteria and meets the requirements, then one would imagine that he would certainly be right up there on the merit list.
Well, tomorrow is when she leaves off. Today is the 13th, right? And she leaves on the today. Tomorrow would be vacant, or the office of the Commissioner of Police would be vacant. What happens in that that period? How long can we stay without an acting or a Commissioner of Police? And how swift does the police service have to act in getting that merit list ready?
Right. I think the 15th might be the cutoff date. But the reality is that once there is no one holding the substantive position, then the Police Service Commissioner would have to at least make an appointment of an acting Commissioner of Police.
Okay. All right. And there's no guarantee that Benjamin will return as acting commissioner. There's no guarantee.
It's entirely up to the PSC, and as I say, the government, if they choose to offer a new 3-year contract to the sitting Commissioner of Police.
All right. All right. And I think we want to thank you for your expert comments there in terms of this particular situation. Of course, the Commissioner of Police, Earl Christopher Haywood Christopher, is reinstated as the Commissioner of Police, and we would continue to monitor that situation there. But I just want to shift focus, Mr. George, if you don't mind, to some other developments,
Sure.
one including let me ask straight away, when a government changes, there's a number of appointed board members in different state enterprises and so on. Is it legal for their dismissal, immediate dismissal, and have we grown accustomed to a natural resignation of these positions?
Well, the thing is, these board members are appointed by the government of the day. All right. So, in other words, the government of the day, basically acting through Corporation Sole, would be the ones who would have that authority to choose whom they want to sit on those boards. So, what has happened in quite a few circumstances is that persons recognizing that, look, there's a change in the guard, and the fact that the new government may want to choose their own persons, then in those circumstances, you would have a scenario where persons would offer their resignations and say, well, look, hey, I am stepping down. I mean, if you wish to call me back, no problem. But, I'm doing the right thing and the decent thing. It's not always done. And one of the areas where I have called out some of our high officials is in terms of the independent bench of the Senate, because I have noticed a trend whereby the independent senators do not want to tender resignations. And, unfortunately, they appear to have been facilitated, I think, by, persons who hold the office of president, in allowing them to basically continue their tenure. And I don't think that's right or proper for good governance or even for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, because it cannot be that you have independent senators sitting there for term after term after term, and you are not, seeking to, refresh the pool of talent, or, use from the widely available resources in terms of, intellect and, social upbringing, and, persons who could bring such a wide range of views to that very important role of independent senator. So, that is one area, Mr. Cox, that, if you look back at our most recent history, in the past, you would see the entire independent bench offer their resignations, and say, well, look, yes, we are willing to serve again if you wish, but, we are doing the right thing. But, of recent vintage, I've noticed that they tend to want to cling tenaciously to that position, and they just stay silent. They don't say anything. Some of them, I mean, one or two might, offer resignations, but generally as a body, they tend to seem to want to cling on to those positions. And I'm not sure that that augurs well for the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago.
All right, and staying with the new government, of course, led by Kamala Persad, historically returning as the first female prime minister in this country, there were some measures, some may appear to be, or promises that may be realistic or unrealistic. But let's go to the most controversial since her presence as prime minister, the buffing of a journalist when asked about the Salaries Reviews Commission position as given or was accepted by the then Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley, and when was asked if she would revert to the regular salary, she shifted the question to Attorney General. Can the Prime Minister and the new government revert that decision that was made by the Dr. Rowley government?
Well, the thing is, all right, so let's just unpack this. And Butterby, as an exercise, I would like to invite our viewers and listeners to submit their versions of how do you spell buff and buffing. I always love to ask people that question,
Well, that's our word.
How do you spell buff?
Well, that's our colloquial way of saying
I know.
Yes.
I know, but
Right.
it's interesting,
Yes.
I remember some years ago in one of these international spelling bee competitions, there was this young girl who was doing so brilliantly well with the spelling, and you would not believe what stumped her and, knocked her out of the competition. They asked her to spell the letter H, and that stumped her. And I'll just share with you, the spelling of the letter H is AITCH. So you have to actually spell a whole word just for the letter H. Anyway, yes, yeah. So back to the question. Yeah, right. So the thing is, when you look at it, just let me have some water. All right. Sorry, but just get back to the question, but just refresh me.
Yeah, it was the whole question of the review or the reverting or taking, not accepting the SRC suggestion, and of course,
right, in terms of the salaries, right? Okay.
Can the government revert that decision?
Right. Okay. So remember that the Salaries Review Commission is an independent, constitutionally appointed body. They made their recommendation. What occurred is that the government of the day under the leadership of then Prime Minister Keith Rowley, they chose to accept the recommendations of the Salaries Review Commission. Now, understand something. It's recommendations, and a government could have chosen to reject the recommendations because, in fact, some of the recommendations for other offices were rejected, right? But those that impacted, I think, the Prime Minister and the members of Parliament, those were accepted, you know. So they do have that ability to accept or reject. However, having done so, now that you have a new government in place, you know, it is difficult, I would think, to say, well, look, you are going to reverse that decision. I mean, I don't think it's impossible, but it certainly is something that you'd have to take into consideration, you know, especially if it has gone into effect already, because then you're talking acting retroactively if it is that persons have already started receiving the higher salaries, etc. However, what has been done in other jurisdictions, and maybe it's something that we can take example from, is where you have governments whose hands have been tied in terms of such increases. Some members of the government have said, well, hey, listen, I personally will donate that part of the increase to, my constituents or my constituency, in a fund to assist the persons who elected me to office, that kind of thing. So there are ways in which a government can show that kind of empathy.
Okay.
And, I think that, in that regard, the question is a valid question as to how do you intend to treat with this in light of the fact that you are now in charge, you have a significant majority in the parliament, and I think that such questions ought to be entertained with grace, dignity, and a level of professionalism whereby you can now account to the public and say, hey, listen, all right, we know that persons are going through a tough time and we want to empathize with you. And therefore, we ourselves are going to either take a salary cut or we're going to contribute some of our salary towards a fund or something of the sort. Those measures, I think, go a long way to having the public understand that you feel their pain and that you are doing things in a tangible way, to show that, look, you can help out in whatever way you can.
Of course, there are a number of categories that this salary situation is impacting when you look at judges and other portfolios outside of our parliamentarians. But Mr. George, just coming to Tobago quickly, I saw something circulating recently with regards to about 13 workers to be compensated.
And the judgment of the industrial court.
The industrial
Right,
court.
yes.
Please speak to that
And
directly.
yes, where the award was somewhere in the vicinity of $3 million. All right.
Correct.
And I saw a report, I think, early this morning, where the chief secretary said that they will be appealing the judgment of the industrial court. But the thing is, okay, first of all, an appeal of a judgment of the industrial court is not something that you are granted automatically. You must show that there is an error on a point of law before you can open that door to an appeal. So you have to assess and analyze the judgment and be able to identify the point of law and say, well, look, on this point of law, we are of the view that the judges made an error and that we are using as the basis for our appeal. Otherwise, the Court of Appeal is going to shut you down very promptly and swiftly to say that you have not met the threshold for filing an appeal against a judgment of the industrial court. So it's quite different from, a normal high court decision, right? The judgments from the industrial court, you must show that there is an error of law. before you can open that door to an appeal. So I'm just mentioning that just as a word of, general caution and advice. I mean, of course, for politicians, you always love the sound bite, and it sounds great to say, well, yes, we're going to appeal, and we're going to challenge it. But the reality is that when you are coming to the legal scenario, there are certain fundamentals which must be met before you can even approach the threshold to open that door.
And what's the convention that speaks to the prohibiting dismissals based on political opinions and so on? There's a particular article that the union actually noted, but are you familiar? Can you share in terms of?
Well, I mean, there's the most fundamental legislation we have is the Constitution, which prohibits, discrimination based on, persons' political views, etc. You have freedom of expression, freedom of, you are free to have your own political views or, whom you choose to support. So it's constitutionally enshrined to start with, Then, of course, you have things like, the Equal Opportunities Act, which also provides, safeguards and, protections for persons in terms of their views and, other aspects. So, we do have legislative provisions which, prevent that. But of course, the question would always be to show that, something was actually politically motivated. I mean, of course, looking at it and, making a common sense assessment, you may say, well, yeah, it seems to be definitely politically motivated. But of course, proven in a court of law that something was actually motivated by political bias, that is something that, is a bit daunting, and you definitely have to have the actual hard evidence to be able to prove so.
All right, so let's go now into the two Tobago seats as we continue to just shift gears, as it were. The Tobago, the TPP would have made history, obviously, a newly formed party under the leadership of Ali Chavez Augustine, would have resoundingly won the 2 seats in Tobago, obviously putting Tobago in a place where we have been before. However, and that the last time we were like that was the Arthur Napoleon, Raymond Robinson, and Mr. Murray. Just speak to the standalone 2 Tobago seats in the parliament of this country, without portfolio, of course, because they did not go up on a UNC ticket. But let's speak to what their responsibilities are in representing Tobago in a meaningful way.
Well, the thing is going to be, I think that it presents an opportunity for very powerful statements to be made in relation to Tobago. And, someone actually asked me yesterday about what used to be the Ministry of Tobago Affairs. And, they asked, well, why isn't there a Minister of Tobago Affairs anymore? So I indicated that, it's possibly because you have the 2 seats and these representatives who can articulate matters on behalf of Tobago. And you also have the THA as the, governing body in Tobago, which can also do the same. But it might be an interesting idea to consider as to whether this government or any government should really bring back this idea of a Minister of Tobago Affairs, meaning that that person can serve as a useful interface between the central government and the THA and these 2 Tobago representatives in the parliament, in the sense of getting things done. So therefore, instead of what we have seen sometimes, a very contentious and, very confrontational approach between the THA and central government, if you have someone who can, have those skills of diplomacy and, be able to facilitate the ease of doing business between the central government and Tobago, it may be something worth considering. So I'm just putting that idea out there, as to whether Tobagonians would welcome the notion of having a Minister of Tobago Affairs who would really be, as I say, that voice that can champion and articulate things. And the reason why I'm saying that is because such a minister would be part of the cabinet and part of central government, as opposed to those who are now holding the two Tobago seats, who are not part of the cabinet, they are not part of the decision making process, and they are not part of central government. So they can speak, our two representatives can speak loudly and vociferously and stridently in the parliament. But unless they get the buy-in from central government, it could just be, basically you shouting in a thunderstorm,
Very good.
basically.
But the leader of the party said that they don't want to be in cabinet because cabinet is for fine China, and their real voice would be heard in the parliament. Let me distinguish the two and understand who really commands the real attention of the general population, as opposed to, so let's differentiate parliament and cabinet, and who really, in which space do you really get the attention?
Well, the thing is, I mean, the parliament would be basically where you have the opportunity to make your speeches, to make your representation, to make your pleas, your petitions, your entreaties, so to speak. But at the end of the day, the decision-making power is in the cabinet. So you need to find China, whether you like it or not.
You need to
And
find
let's also remember, Brother B,
Yeah.
because I always love to share the legal perspective. Let's also remember the seminal judgment of Justice Nadia Kangaloo in the matter of THA versus Attorney General, where she made it pellucid that on matters of policy, the THA is subject to the decisions of the cabinet as under Section 75 of the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. So therefore, once it's a policy issue, you could make as much noise as you wish in Parliament. If the cabinet says yes, it is yes. If the cabinet says no, it is no. And we need to understand that. So, I mean, as I say, these things sound nice as sound bites, for the cameras and the press and, on the microphones. But the reality is, if you think back, Brother B, to days when you were small and growing up, when your parents had any important guests or visitors, that is when they bring out the fine china. So the fine china has a purpose, and it
All right.
shows
Very
the
good.
rank and
Okay.
authority of the cabinet.
Very good. All right. So that is clear. And yeah, so sometimes politicians go off on a tangent because they get the crowd behind them and they see all kind of thing and they feel they can get away with it. But we wouldn't allow them to. But anyway, let's come now to, you mentioned earlier that there was always contention and a standoffish relationship between the THA, and we could go back to Charles Pandy, Kamala Prasad Bissessa over London, and right up to Rowley and Farley. Do you see this new accommodation, and I say that, given the relationship that with the TPP and, of course, the Prime Minister so far, do you see better days for Tobago going forward with this new accommodation?
Well, I would imagine that this newly formed government would want to show a different approach from the previous government. And one would imagine that there would be much more of a rapprochement between themselves and the leadership of the THA, in that I would think that communication would be a lot easier, a lot better, a lot more respectful, and a lot more facilitated. All right, because I think they would definitely want to show, well, look, we are doing things differently from our predecessors. So in that regard, one would imagine that it may be a smoother pathway to resolving some of the issues which have bedeviled this, often contentious relationship between the THA and central government. But you see, we must still bear in mind that notwithstanding all the authority that has been devolved to the Tobago House of Assembly under the fifth schedule of the Tobago House of Assembly Act, remember, on all these matters, once it comes to a question of policy, you are subject to the dictates of the cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay. And just before we close, Mr. George, just going back to the whole system and governance and parliamentary and stuff. In terms of senators, now we saw, I think the last thing I saw would have been 11 senators coming from the leader of government, Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa, still about what, to make it 16 of her appointed senators, and of course the opposition is still to name 6. The possibility of Tobago, we had Mr. Lawrence serving, and we had Mr. Dennis serving, the possibility of Tobago having its say in the Senate. How would that, is that up to the discretion of our leaders?
Yes, it is entirely up to the discretion of the political leaders. But you see, again, it brings back the question of the independent bench, because one would hope that the president would use this opportunity to change out the members of the independent bench, and from that change, she, of her own discretion, can appoint someone who is maybe a champion of causes for Tobago or a voice for Tobago, who can, speak on issues to Tobago, So you have the opportunity by the prime minister, you have the opportunity by the leader of the opposition, and you also have the opportunity by the president, if the president chooses to change the members of the independent bench. In other words, if they don't voluntarily resign, then I would urge the president to consider changing out the members of the independent bench, because when people get too comfortable for too long in the same position, of course, it doesn't augur well for good governance and for continuity for us as a nation.
All right. Okay, Mr. George, we want to thank you very much for being with us this morning as usual. And of course, continue to post your very lovely pictures across the world when you go out, and I see you on Facebook and so on, and enjoying your life. Thank you for being with us this morning. Yes?
It's always a pleasure, and thank you.